Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology, and first daily Mormon history podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. We're continuing a conversation with Lynne Whitesides, the first member of the September 6. We'll talk about her life growing up outside of the church and what it was like to be a convert at BYU at just a young age of 18. You won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. So let's go back and talk about your growing up. So you grew up, is it Italian Catholic or?
No, actually, my grandmother was from Italy. My grandfather was from Germany, and my mom grew up with basically immigrants, right? Even though my grandmother, I think, was either her mother was pregnant or she was born here, but she spoke only Italian until she was in 8th grade. So I grew up with those people. They were my grandparents. I hung out with them. So my grandmother made really just one what's the word? Concession to my grandfather. She became a Lutheran and let go of Catholicism. Okay. So I was raised Lutheran, actually. Okay. And then it's kind of a long story, but my parents moved a lot when I was a kid. I moved in 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Wow. And at some point, I kind of didn't want to do that anymore, and I started investigating the Mormon Church, and I thought there's something about it that felt stable to me, I think, at 17. And they were totally against me becoming Mormon completely because they just thought it was the weirdest church. And so I started investigating, and I got to also say the missionaries were very cute, and I was 17. So I was in Florida, and then they moved back up to Pennsylvania. I went from Pennsylvania to Florida a bunch of times. So they moved back to Pennsylvania, and that's where I became a Mormon. I was baptized in New Jersey. And then my parents went to my baptism, and 2 months later, they became Mormon.
Oh, wow.
And then all of my Italian family became Mormon. So there was
way.
Yeah, there's I don't know, 30 of them, something like my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, my brother.
Is that because of you?
My parents were going around doing it all. I was at BYU by this point. Okay. So everybody just kind of became Mormon. So
wow.
It was like maybe 20, something like that, became Mormon. And that changed everything too, because by this time I was at BYU, and I was becoming a little clearer because the church in Pennsylvania is very different than the church in Provo, Utah. Yeah. And I remember thinking, oh man, now all these people are joining. What am I going to do? This is not the way they said. They didn't. When I joined, they didn't talk about racism. They didn't talk about misogyny. They didn't talk about much, really. They just come in. It's this lovely family thing. So, and when you're 17, you're not investigating too much because the missionaries are cute. So, and that's sort of how I got into the church, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then I went to BYU.
And so you went to BYU. You were kind of a fish out of water at BYU?
Totally fish out of water.
Okay.
At my second year at BYU, I got called in and they said, we think another university might be better for you. I think it may have been because I was hitchhiking to church and I was wearing, it wasn't a match. It just wasn't a match. And I realized it wasn't. So that's kind of what happened.
Hitchhiking, don't you just go to your classes to go to church?
No, actually, because the awards were all over the place back in 70. I mean, they were all over Provo, right? But anyway, the whole thing is they said, we think another university would be better for you.
And you should have come down the road
I know.
Utah Tech at the time.
Yeah,
right?
I should have, right? I don't even know if it was there, or gone up to the U of U. But that started. Was my entrance into being a Mormon in the Wasatch Front.
But did you graduate from BYU?
You know what? I never did graduate. I just, I didn't. I started working. Part of it is I grew up pretty poor and there was not a lot of money. So I started working. And when I started working, I had to kind of work and I just didn't go to school. I was paying for my life and then got married and when I was 26, because I continued to work. And then I actually put him through med school, and then I went back to school right after I stopped working for Sunstone, and I was in school for a couple of years, loved it, doing really well, but then I got kicked out of the church, and then I just started doing getting kicked out of the church created a whole talks, there's a whole bunch of stuff that went along with being kicked out of the church as a part of the September 6. I was doing newspaper stuff and talks and all of that. And then and then my marriage fell apart. And then I just didn't go back to school. And then I opened up a practice. I'm a life coach. I have read a lot of stuff around the psyche and Jung and Freud. From the time I was 17, I'd spent a lot of time really investigating the way the mind works. And then in 1990, see, it was what year? So 1993, when I got kicked out, I found a fantastic therapist who saw something in me, and I started attending a group that teaches people how to do a particular kind of counseling. So in the group, there are therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists. We've been in that group for 23 years every Thursday night, and he helped me open a practice, and now I'm a life coach.
Okay. For lack of a better word, did you lose your testimony in 1993 when they kicked you out, or?
No, by 1993, I think I was a little more aware of things. Like that the church actually believed that God lived on a planet next to Kolob and had body parts and passions in a way that I hadn't understood before. But mostly the misogyny and the homophobia and the racism, to me, that was I couldn't understand why everybody wasn't up in arms with Packer giving that talk, for instance. He was saying we are misogynist. He was saying we are homophobic. He was saying we are anti-intellectual.
In 1993, that would have been pretty common for most of the United States to be homophobic, though, wouldn't it?
But don't say that you're a church that, to me, don't say that this is a church that is about love, because that's not about love. I don't give a crap what everybody was saying at the time.
Because I'm trying to remember the political situation. It seems like that was when they passed the Defensive Marriage Act in the Congress.
That was going on, but also the ERA didn't pass.
Well, that was back in the 70s.
But that was also the misogyny part.
Okay.
Which, by the way, the church did everything it could to not pass that ERA.
Right.
And then the marriage.
So there's a lot, because it seems like we're condensing a lot of stuff. So you got the ERA.
But you're asking me what helped me.
In
yeah.
76, roughly 78.
78.
78. So 78, does the church put a big push to shut
to keep
down
women
the
in their
ERA
place?
Keep women in their place, as you say. And so, what about 1978? It sounds like you joined the church probably in 1970 or so?
1970.
Oh, in 1970. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you probably recognize the racism between 70 and 78.
Yeah, but not because, here's what's interesting. I left and went to BYU. When at BYU, there was no color.
Right.
It was so it didn't really hit me.
Right.
Until a little while later, when I started really reading stuff and understanding. But to say, let me just say this, let me think this so that I can be clear. To say, wasn't that the way the world was anyway? To me, is a church is it really the part of the world? It's the old, is it a hospital or is it a social club? And the fact that a church that touts itself as Jesus is the head of the church and it's love and that, and then to have one of the authorities actually blatantly say that. And not just that, but when I was reading the John Birchers, all of that stuff too, all of a sudden it was this is not the church I thought it was. This church is not this loving, kind, wonderful church. It's as big of a mess as the rest of the world. And I know that's a little naive to think that it wouldn't be, but it woke me up. And I was just I'm going to go find something else because I don't want to be part of that.
So can you talk about your feelings of June 1978 when the revelation came to allow blacks to have the priesthood? Was that a good day? Was that a bad day?
Well, it was a great day. Don't get me wrong. But what I found out from Mike Quinn was that it was kind of at the same time when they were doing temples in Brazil and no one knew who was black or white. Uh-huh. And so they didn't know what to do. And so this revelation came. And so do I believe it was a revelation? Probably not. I think it was convenient. And they had to do that. The church is a growing church. It's a proselyting church. So it was too convenient.
When you say too convenient, were those your thoughts in 78 or did that come later?
In 78, I wondered. What was, that's an interesting thing that now this is coming out, Mm-hmm.
The reason why I ask you, Matt Harris is a professor at Colorado State in Pueblo, Colorado.
Yeah.
And he's got a new book coming out that I cannot wait one of theses that's going to come out is there were some apostles that were hardliners that were that believed in the race ban, and so President Kimball purposely announced a temple in 74, I think it was, to get apostles to say, there's a big race problem in Brazil. What are we going to do? And so Matt's
That's one way. I mean, it's possible. It's possible. Of course, he wrote that lovely book, The Miracle of Forgiveness, Kimball. So, I mean, I don't have a lot of faith in them. I guess that's the bottom line, Well, the fact that that was even a question, that there were hardliners about race in this church. It just is. This doesn't work in the way I see the world.
Okay,
right?
okay.
It just doesn't work. Like, why wouldn't whoever was the president of the church or the prophet of the church say, this is ridiculous. We're not going to do this. This is not okay.
Okay.
And I mean, it's still a problem, but
So because we've also got the Equal Rights Amendment. President Kimball was against that, definitely. Did you know Sonia Johnson, or do you?
No, but I was influenced by Sonia Johnson. I
influenced.
I gave a talk at Sunstone saying, we're standing on her shoulders as feminists,
Okay.
and she was standing on other feminists. We all stand on each other's shoulders, but she was a real wake up for a lot of us. Well, that was a wake up. Do you want to know what the actually big wake up was? Although Sonia was part of it, but it was who was I think it wasn't Kimball. It was in the 80s. Whoever was the president of the church, might have been Benson, gave a talk, and he quoted Kimball, I think, saying, women, come home from the typewriter, come home from the office, come home and make beds and clean house for your family, because that's what you're here to do. And for a ton of us, that's how Mormon Women's Forum got formed out of that talk.
Oh.
Because everyone watched it and were like, wow, like that's actually the way you see women. That's what this church sees for women. But it was also, like, don't come home from the attorney's office or anything, but come home from the typewriter, come home from the, as if women were here just to serve. And I think it's a culmination of things.
Okay.
Don't you think? Like, it builds on things.
Because what I'm hearing is so late 70s, early 80s, the priesthood ban was removed, which, while good, you were like, why did it exist in the first place?
Yeah.
ERA's going, and you're like, women's rights, I believe in that. And then it sounds like you were ahead of the nation, I'll say, as far as gay rights, because, Defense of Marriage Act was the early 90s. Bill Clinton, I remember, signed that into law. And so we've got the kind of this bubbling up of, Elder Packer would say, the three threats to the church: gays, intellectuals, and feminists.
Feminists and intellectuals and homosexuals,
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thing, right, to say.
And so those were kind of causing you a lot of personal anguish, I guess, with the church?
Well, part with the church, you know what, also, women weren't giving prayers in sacrament until 78. I mean, they had taken a lot. Oh, there was one other thing that happened too, and which I think is okay to talk about now. So at the time, there was, I'm trying to remember, who was the Relief Society president in the church? Chieko was one of the counselors, and there was Elaine Clyde, who was a counselor, and
Sherry Dew?
No, Jack.
Oh, Elaine Jack.
Elaine Jack. So we had a Mormon Women's Forum, a meeting at my house, and Elaine Klein came to that meeting and said this to us. And this is when everybody was kind of waking up. She said they'd been in the Relief Society presidency for like 3 or 4 years or something. And Mrs. America, who was a Mormon, had just met with whoever the prophet was, which was
Miss America?
Yeah, Mrs. America had
Mrs.
met with, was it Hinckley? Maybe Hinckley or Benson, one
In
of
the
them. Hinckley.
80s, it would have been either Kimball or Benson.
No,
probably.
Kimball was gone.
So Benson?
Benson, it was the 90s.
Oh.
It was the 90s.
That would have been after Benson was Hunter.
Yeah, but he didn't last long. It was Hinckley, I think.
Hinckley, okay.
But I'm not sure. But whoever it was, she said Mrs. America had just met with the prophet. She said, how often do you think the Relief Society president has met with this prophet? We've been in there for 5 years or something. We said once a year. She said 0.
Really?
She said, we don't get to do that. We don't get to meet with him. In fact, they had been set aside. They had, the things when they set people aside. The first. I
You
guess
mean set apart?
Yeah, set apart, set aside, whatever. Yeah. But I'm telling the story, but it's so long ago, I don't think it'll matter. But because those guys aren't even around anymore. But they had been set apart as being in charge of all the women, and then whoever did that went out, and another general authority came in and said that was the wrong setting apart, and he set them apart to be only over them, so that in the past, if there was a problem in Ohio, the women could decide they could go do that. But now, if there was women in Ohio who are having a problem, they had to go to the general authority and go through them in order to go out there. So they had lost a lot of their power.
The Relief Society.
The Relief Society, and which was also really interesting for us. And I know that what they were hoping, because they were really wonderful women, Aline and Chaco were wonderful women. I mean, Chaco just said, "Hey, these people at Sunstone are just like, kids in the programs for smart kids. Why don't you just leave them alone?" But I think they were hoping that we would push the envelope out a little bit for them, so they had some movement. In fact, the day of my court, I got a call from Aline Clyde saying, "Please don't get excommunicated. We need you guys to do this thing. We want you to move out the envelope so we have more room to move." But
this is Elaine
Clyde
from the
yes.
General Relief Society presidency.
Yes. And I also got a call from Connie Chung's people asking me if I would take in a hidden camera, which I said no. But because remember, Connie Chung had a news report thing at that time. Yeah. She had called me the same day. But
oh wow. She was CBS News.
Yeah, she was CBS News. It was interesting, but I said no. But it was interesting because I could tell how much they loved the women of the church, these women, and they had every power was getting taken away from them, and so that was coming into us too. We understood that Mormon Women's Forum was becoming more and more aware of the limits of what was happening and taking away instead of giving women more and more, room to actually be who they are, to do that. That kind of pushed us on as well.
Okay, so I think I get a better sense of the things that were bothering you from probably the late 70s. Because it sounds so when you first baptized, you came in, you didn't know anything.
No.
And then, can you think about when did you first notice that racism or sexism was a problem?
Well,
was it 78 when the church is announced the rescission of the ban and the ERA? They're against the ERA?
Well, let me also say this. When I became a Mormon, I was 17 when I was investigating, 18 when I joined.
Okay.
I looked very young. And so I went for my interviews, and no one asked me any sexual question at all. None.
Well, those aren't typical baptism questions.
Yeah, they are. Have you had sex?
Oh, well, you obey the law of chastity, I guess.
Not a word.
Really?
Not a word. So when I went in for my patriarchal blessing, my bishop asked me those questions. And I looked at him and I said, "I think you're a lecherous old man. This is none of your business." Oh. And he did not know. He said, "No one's asked you these questions?" And I said, "No." So I came in not knowing a lot of this stuff.
Okay. So
it was really like shock after shock. It was, I was at really? You think that's your business? That is really weird, So I was reeling from that as well. Just kind of like, okay, this is really different than I thought. The race thing, I'd always been aware of race issues, but because I was in Provo and there were no people of color at all,
they
really.
Didn't even have any on the football team back then.
I don't think so, right? So nobody was. So it didn't sink into my consciousness until maybe a couple years before understanding. Wait a minute, there's a ban. You can't even have a drop of blood and be Mormon. A drop of blood that they consider black and
Well, we would baptize them. We just wouldn't give them the priesthood.
But you couldn't go to the temple.
Right.
Yeah. You couldn't do anything. You could, it was ridiculous. It was just ridiculous. And so that stuff was really bubbling up to me as well. I'd spent my childhood reading about everything that I could possibly read, beginning with the Holocaust and then racism and then the Native Americans and understanding the problems. And for some reason, I don't know why, but because of the way the church presented itself, I thought it would be different. Mm-hmm. So it shocked me just a little bit that it wasn't. And that's kind of how it started.
Okay. So you're wrestling in the 80s with feminism, racism, even gay rights?
Even gay rights. Because I had a lot of gay friends by then.
Okay.
It's BYU. I have a lot of gay friends. Even back then, right? So,
okay.
I had gay friends. I had gay friends who killed themselves, actually, because of the church and the standing. So all that stuff was a pretty kind of tumultuous time with racism and misogyny and homophobia. All of that was part of what we were doing at Sunstone, was trying to raise the consciousness of how do we do this. And at that point, I really was hopeful that the church would kind of want to shift the way it was responding to people. And so when we were doing it and we were having all these sessions, I kind of thought, well, this is great. This is kind of working, right? This is like people are coming, we're talking about it, all of that. And then they went after anybody who was a professor at BYU, which was, trying to shut down Sunstone.
Yeah, which they never did.
Which they never did, but they tried, but it's this, it's.
So they told BYU professors you can't go to Sunstone anymore.
Well, who got also kicked out of Cecilia? Do you remember Cecilia Farr and David Knowlton? Right after us, they were also kicked out of BYU. Like there's a lot of stuff. It was almost like it was a purge. Mm-hmm. It was a purge going after anyone who wasn't really towing the line.
Okay.
And that was also like I was shocked. First of all, we were stay-at-home moms, a lot of us. So I couldn't figure out what they were so all worked up about. We were just doing stuff, right? I was raising kids and putting people through his residency and all that kind of stuff. And what was the big deal? But apparently it was a big deal.
Huh.
Yeah.
And so basically when your church court happened, did you attend?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So you attended, met in the bishop's office. He said...
Well, because I was the first, I didn't know nobody knew what was happening with I was the first.
Because you were the first one.
Yes.
And so then the dominoes started falling after you.
They started here's what's really funny. So, I go to church, I don't know what's going to happen. There are a couple hundred people singing hymns outside with signs that say Lynne is not a heretic. First of all, that was an interesting moment. And then two of my witnesses, Margaret and Lavina were witnesses.
Margaret
Toscano and Lavina were my witnesses. These people who I adore beyond belief, right? But then they're in their shoes. So here's the people who are standing up for me. And I was just, after when it started happening, it was just amusing. Well, there you go. There you go. Yeah. There you go. That's not going to hold any water. But I was so happy that they did it. I had 5 witnesses. So my father at one point looked at the bishop and said, if you excommunicate my daughter, because he was a very big Mormon believer by that time. But anyway, so it was, when I look back and see that, it's pretty funny.
Okay. So you had the church court. The bishop didn't have the heart to excommunicate you. He said, I'm going to go the soft route. I'm going to disfellowship you.
Me. Yeah.
But at that point, you were like, you know what? If you don't like me, I don't like you. I'm done with this.
Well, other things happened, things began happening. Part of it was I found this amazing therapist, and I started really working with that, and then my marriage fell apart, and Is
that because of your excommunication, or you weren't excommunicated, but because of the punishment? Church punishment?
I think it was more because we got married after knowing each other for 4 months, and had 3 kids really fast, and went to med school, and all of that was really... When you look at that, we were in our 20s, we're stupid, just put so much on our plate. That's part of it. he was an introvert, and that was a pretty extroverted experience. And so I think that was difficult for him because the phone was ringing constantly, and I was running the symposium. Like, there were always people at our house. So that there was partly that. You can't blame it. Would never blame it just on that. It was a the perfect storm of this is what's going to happen. So when that fell apart, and then I was supposed to have alimony till I was 65, but he got Parkinson's a few years after we got a divorce, and so I ended up not having alimony, and I had to figure out a way to financially take care of myself. And I have a natural gift of working with people, and so I started to practice, and so that's kind of what happened.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Lynne Whitesides, the first member of the September 6. Our next conversation with Lynne is going to be our last, so be sure you sign up to our free newsletter, so I'll send you a secret link to the final part of our conversation. Sign up at gospeltangents.com/newsletter, and we'll talk a little bit about how the family reacted to her becoming a member of the September 6.
Actually, it was really difficult for me because my parents did not have my back. They said that I probably never believed the church in the first place, and that they sided with the church, which was very difficult for me. And then my father had a near-death experience, and when he had his near-death experience, everything changed.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, subscribe on either Patreon or at gospeltangents.com. For just $5 a month, you can hear the entire audio uninterrupted. On our $10 tier, if you would like to see the whole video, you can see that either on youtube.com/gospeltangents, or I've got a special Facebook group devoted for full videos. So subscribe at gospeltangents.com and sign up for just $10 a month. For $20 a month, if you'd like to get some bonus content, maybe some of the stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor, you can sign up for that. And then if you'd like to talk to me for $100 a month, we'll do a monthly phone call on something like Zoom, and you can ask me anything you want. So thanks again. Also, don't forget about the merch, mugs, t-shirts, hats, things like that. I'm trying to get the ties up there. Hopefully I can get up there. And thanks again for watching Gospel Tangents, and click here for some more videos.